I was the only one not invited to the family photo. Hi everyone! Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. The golden anniversary celebration was everything my parents had dreamed it would be. 50 years of marriage deserved nothing less than the elegant venue they had chosen. The historic mansion on the outskirts of town with its manicured gardens and crystal chandeliers. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting warm light across the polished hardwood floors where relatives I hadn't seen in years mingled with champagne glasses and genuine smiles. I stood near the gift table, watching my mother in her pearl-colored dress accept congratulations from my father's side of the family. She looked radiant, the way she always did when she was the center of attention, her silver hair perfectly styled and her makeup flawless despite the emotional moments throughout the day. My father, distinguished in his navy suit, kept his arm around her waist as they posed for impromptu photos with various relatives and family friends. The room buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes from bringing together people who share decades of history. Cousins compared notes about their children's accomplishments, aunts exchanged recipes and gossip, and uncles told the same stories they'd been telling at family gatherings for as long as I could remember. The sound of laughter mixed with clinking glasses and the soft jazz quartet my parents had hired for the occasion. I had arrived early, wanting to help with last-minute preparations and hoping to spend some quality time with my parents before the festivities began. It had been almost 8 months since I'd seen them, the longest stretch since I'd graduated from college 5 years ago. Work had been demanding, and the 3-hour drive from my apartment in the city to my hometown always seemed to get postponed by one urgent project or another. But I was here now, and I was determined to make the most of it. This was a milestone celebration, a moment that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. I wanted to be part of that memory, to feel like the valued family member I hoped I still was despite the physical distance and increasingly infrequent phone calls. My younger brother Michael had flown in from California with his wife Jennifer and their 2 young children. They were the golden couple of our family. He with his successful tech career and she with her Pinterest-perfect lifestyle. Their kids, 6-year-old Emma and 4-year-old Lucas, were the absolute stars of every family gathering, and today was no exception. I watched them charming relatives with their gap-toothed smiles and carefully rehearsed recitations of their latest achievements in school and soccer. My sister Rebecca lived only 20 minutes from our parents, and she had clearly taken charge of much of the party planning. She moved through the room with the confidence of someone who belonged, adjusting flower arrangements and directing the catering staff with the authority that came from being the daughter who had stayed close to home. She had married her high school sweetheart, bought a house in the same neighborhood where we'd grown up, and provided my parents with regular visits and involvement in their daily lives. Standing there, holding my champagne glass and trying to find my place in the conversations swirling around me, I felt the familiar sensation of being simultaneously part of and separate from my family. I shared their DNA, their childhood memories, their inside jokes and references to people and events from decades past. But somehow, I had become the family member who lived at the periphery, who showed up for major occasions but wasn't woven into the daily fabric of their lives. It hadn't always been this way. Growing up, I had been close to both my parents, especially my mother. I was the middle child, the one who mediated between Michael's rebellious phases and Rebecca's perfectionist tendencies. I was the one who helped my mother with dinner preparations, who sat with my father in his workshop learning to use his tools, who served as the bridge between my siblings when they were fighting. But college had changed things. I had chosen a university across the state, drawn by their journalism program and the opportunities it might provide. My parents had been proud but worried I was the first in our family to move so far away for school. The visits home became less frequent as I got involved in campus activities, internships, and eventually a serious relationship that consumed most of my free time. After graduation, I had found a job with a small newspaper in the city, covering local politics and community events. It wasn't glamorous work, and the pay was modest, but I loved the challenge of investigative reporting and the sense that I was making a difference in people's lives. My family, however, had never quite understood my career choice. They wanted to be proud of me, but journalism wasn't a profession they could easily explain to their friends and neighbors the way they could brag about Michael's software development work or Rebecca's successful real estate career. The distance had grown gradually, almost imperceptibly. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Holiday visits felt more obligatory than joyful. I found myself feeling like an outsider looking in on the life my family had built without me, wondering if my absence had become so normalized that my presence was almost an inconvenience. But today was supposed to be different. Today was about celebrating my parents' incredible milestone, about bringing the family together for a moment of pure joy and gratitude. I had bought them a beautiful crystal vase that I knew my mother would love, and I had prepared a short speech about their relationship and what it had meant to all of us children to grow up in a home filled with their love and commitment. As the afternoon progressed, I made efforts to connect with relatives and reestablish bonds that had grown loose over the years. I played with Emma and Lucas, helping them with the craft activities Rebecca had set up at a children's table. I caught up with my cousin Sarah about her new job and listened to my Uncle Tom's stories about his recent fishing trip. I complimented my Aunt Marie on her homemade desserts and asked my grandmother about her garden. Everyone was polite, even warm, but there was something indefinable that felt different from family gatherings of the past. Conversation seemed to end just a beat too quickly when I approached. People asked about my work and my life in the city, but their eyes would drift over my shoulder as if looking for someone more interesting to talk to. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the feeling of being on the outside was just in my head. My mother seemed genuinely happy to see me, hugging me tightly when I first arrived and introducing me to family friends with obvious pride. But even with her, there was something that felt slightly strained, as if we were both working a little too hard to recreate the easy intimacy we had once shared. She complimented my dress, asked about my apartment, and made sure I had enough to eat, but our conversations felt more like polite hostess-guest interactions than the deep mother-daughter connection I remembered from my teenage years. The afternoon moved forward with the predictable rhythm of family celebrations. There were toasts and speeches, the cutting of an elaborate anniversary cake, and the opening of gifts. I watched my parents' faces light up as they unwrapped presents from various relatives' photo albums, jewelry, decorative items for their home. When they opened my crystal vase, my mother smiled and thanked me genuinely, but I couldn't help noticing that it was set aside more quickly than some of the other gifts, and without the extended commentary she gave to presents from Michael and Rebecca. As we moved toward the later part of the afternoon, the energy in the room shifted toward the kind of organized activities that mark the climax of family celebrations. Rebecca had arranged for a slideshow of photos from my parents' 50 years together, which played on a large screen while everyone gathered around to watch and comment. There were pictures from their wedding, early years of marriage, the births of their children, family vacations, holidays, graduations, and milestone moments that told the story of their life together. I found myself standing toward the back of the group, looking at images of my own childhood and adolescence projected on the screen. There I was at age 5, missing my front teeth and wearing a frilly pink dress at Easter. There was 8-year-old me at Christmas, hugging a doll I had desperately wanted. Teenage me at my high school graduation, standing between my proud parents with my diploma in hand. But as the slideshow progressed through more recent years, I began to notice something unsettling. The images from the past 5 years since I had graduated from college and moved away featured fewer and fewer pictures of me. There were plenty of photos of Michael's family, of Rebecca's milestones and achievements, of my parents with their local grandchildren. But my presence in the visual narrative of our family seemed to fade as the years went on, until the most recent photos showed family gatherings where I was either absent or barely visible in the background. It was like watching myself slowly disappear from my own family's story. After the slideshow ended and people had dispersed back into smaller conversation groups, I noticed Rebecca talking quietly with the photographer my parents had hired for the event. She was gesturing toward different areas of the room and consulting a list she had written on a small piece of paper. I realized she was organizing the formal family photos that would serve as the permanent record of this golden anniversary celebration. My heart began to beat a little faster with anticipation. Family photos had always been important in our household. Our hallways and living room were lined with professional portraits from various stages of our lives: school pictures, wedding photos, graduation ceremonies, holiday portraits. I knew that today's photos would take their place among these treasured images, and the thought of being included in such an important family milestone filled me with warmth. I watched as Rebecca continued her discussion with the photographer, pointing toward the elegant staircase in the main foyer where the lighting was most flattering. The photographer nodded and began setting up his equipment, adjusting lights and checking camera angles. Other family members started to notice the preparations and began to gather in the area, smoothing their hair and checking their appearance. "Okay, everyone." Rebecca's voice carried across the room with the authority of someone who had clearly taken charge of this aspect of the celebration. "We're going to do the family photos now. If we could have all the immediate family members gather in the foyer, that would be wonderful." There was a general movement toward the designated area, with people finishing their conversations and setting down their drinks. I felt a flutter of excitement as I moved with the group, mentally preparing myself for the formal poses and group arrangements that would follow. My parents positioned themselves at the center of the group, my mother smoothing her dress and my father adjusting his tie. Michael and Jennifer took their places with Emma and Lucas, the children looking adorable but fidgety in their party clothes. Rebecca stood next to my mother, looking polished and confident as always. "Let's start with just Mom and Dad," the photographer suggested, and my parents moved into position. The camera clicked several times as they posed together, looking elegant and happy in the soft lighting of the foyer. "Now let's add the children," Rebecca directed. "Michael, Jennifer, and the kids over here. Rebecca, you stand on Mom's other side." I stood waiting for my turn to be included, watching as my siblings arranged themselves around our parents. The photographer took several shots of this configuration, asking them to turn slightly, to smile, to look at him, to look at each other. "Beautiful," he said, reviewing the images on his camera's display. "These are going to be wonderful. Now let's do one with all the grandchildren," my mother suggested, and Emma and Lucas were repositioned front and center while the adults adjusted around them. More clicks of the camera, more adjustments to poses and expressions. I continued to stand at the edge of the group, not exactly in the frame, but not excluded either, waiting for the moment when I would be invited to join. Other relatives had gathered to watch, and I was aware of them looking on as the immediate family posed for what would undoubtedly become the centerpiece portraits of the anniversary celebration. "Let's try one more with just the original family," the photographer said, and I felt a moment of confusion. Weren't we already photographing the original family? But then I realized he was referring to my parents and their children, which should have included me. Michael, Jennifer, Rebecca, and my parents rearranged themselves for this shot. I took a small step forward, expecting to be waved into the group, but no invitation came. "Perfect," Rebecca said, looking at the arrangement. "This captures everyone beautifully." I stood there for a moment, not quite understanding what was happening. Surely this was an oversight, a momentary confusion in the logistics of organizing a large group photo. I waited for someone to notice that I wasn't included, to call out my name and gesture me into the frame. But the camera continued clicking, and nobody seemed to notice my absence. "Could we get a few with the in-laws too?" Jennifer asked, and suddenly the arrangement expanded to include spouses and their families. Still, no one looked in my direction or suggested that I join the group. I felt my cheeks beginning to burn with embarrassment and confusion. There had to be some kind of mistake. Perhaps they were planning to take several different groupings and would include me in the next one. Perhaps Rebecca had a specific order in mind and my turn was coming up. But as the photo session continued with various combinations of family members, grandparents with grandchildren, siblings together, parents with sons-in-law and daughters-in-law, I remained standing at the periphery, watching my family pose for the pictures that would commemorate this important day. The realization came slowly, like a cold tide creeping up a beach. This wasn't an oversight or a scheduling confusion. I wasn't being forgotten accidentally. I was being excluded deliberately. The understanding hit me like a physical blow. My own family. The people who had raised me, who had celebrated my achievements, who had shared every important moment of my life for the first 18 years, were posing for formal photographs that would hang in their homes and be shared with friends and extended family for years to come. And they were doing it without me. I looked around at the faces of the relatives who were watching the photo session, wondering if any of them had noticed my exclusion. If any of them found it strange that one of the 3 children was not being included in the family portraits. But everyone seemed focused on the posing family members, smiling and making encouraging comments about how wonderful the pictures were going to be. My throat felt tight, and I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. I couldn't understand what I had done to deserve this treatment. What offense I had committed that warranted being erased from my family's most important photographs. Had I said something wrong during the party? Had I unknowingly insulted someone or behaved inappropriately? I tried to catch my mother's eye, hoping she would notice my absence and correct what I still desperately hoped was an honest mistake. But she was fully engaged with the photographer's directions, adjusting her pose and making sure her grandchildren were looking at the camera. Finally, I found the courage to speak up. Should I be in some of these pictures? I asked, my voice coming out smaller and more uncertain than I intended. The photographer paused and looked at Rebecca, clearly deferring to her as the organizer of the session. "Oh," Rebecca said, as if she had just noticed I was there. "We're just doing the immediate family right now. The ones who are, here regularly." The casual cruelty of her words took my breath away. The ones who are here regularly. As if my physical distance from the family home had somehow revoked my membership in the family itself. "But I am immediate family," I said, hearing the pleading note in my voice and hating myself for it. "I'm your sister. I'm their daughter." "Of course you are," my mother said quickly, but she didn't step out of the photographer's arrangement or suggest that I be included. "We can take some casual photos with everyone later." Casual photos. Not the formal professional portraits that would be framed and displayed, but casual snapshots that might or might not be taken, depending on whether anyone remembered or bothered. Michael looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Jennifer kept her focus on making sure her children were behaving properly. My father seemed oblivious to the tension, smiling at the camera and following the photographer's instructions. "I think we have enough shots of this grouping," the photographer said diplomatically. "Should we move on to extended family?" "Yes, let's get all the aunts and uncles and cousins," Rebecca agreed. And suddenly there was a general movement as more relatives joined the photo arrangement. I watched as people who shared much more distant relationships with my parents than I did were welcomed into the frame, their presence considered valuable enough to document for posterity. I stood frozen in place, watching my extended family arrange themselves for pictures that would include second cousins and great aunts. But not me, the daughter who had driven 3 hours to be here, who had bought a thoughtful gift, who had been looking forward to the celebration for weeks. The photo session continued for another 10 minutes, with various combinations of relatives posing for the photographer. At no point was I invited to join any of the arrangements. At no point did anyone suggest that perhaps the immediate family photos should be retaken to include all 3 children. When it was finally over and people began to disperse back to their conversations and refreshments, I felt like I had been sleepwalking through a nightmare. The exclusion was so complete, so deliberate, that I couldn't pretend it had been accidental. I needed air. I needed space to process what had just happened and figure out how to respond. I slipped out through the French doors that led to the mansion's garden, hoping to find a quiet spot where I could collect myself before rejoining the party. The garden was beautiful in the late afternoon light, with carefully maintained flower beds and a small fountain that provided a peaceful counterpoint to the celebration noise from inside. I sat on a stone bench and tried to make sense of what had just occurred. How long had my family been planning this exclusion? Had they discussed it beforehand, deciding collectively that I didn't deserve to be included in the permanent record of this milestone? Or had it been a spontaneous decision driven by some impulse I couldn't understand? I thought back over the past few years, looking for clues I might have missed. There had been moments of tension, certainly. Phone calls that felt strained, visits that didn't go as smoothly as they had in the past, but nothing that seemed to warrant this level of rejection. Or maybe I had been too self-absorbed to notice how my family really felt about me. Maybe my absence from their daily lives had created a resentment I hadn't recognized. Maybe they saw me as the daughter who had abandoned them for a career and a life they didn't understand or approve of. I was still sitting in the garden trying to process my emotions when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I turned to see my cousin Sarah approaching with a concerned expression. "Are you okay?" she asked, sitting down beside me on the bench. "I noticed you seemed upset during the photos." The kindness in her voice almost broke down the careful composure I had been maintaining. I felt tears starting to form and blinked them back, not wanting to break down completely. "Did you notice anything strange about the photo session?" I asked carefully, not wanting to sound paranoid or self-pitying. Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I did notice that you weren't included in the family shots," she said gently. "I thought maybe you didn't want to be in them, or that you were planning to join a later group." "I was waiting to be invited," I told her. "I was standing right there waiting for someone to call me over." "Oh, honey," Sarah said, her voice full of sympathy. "I'm so sorry. That must have been awful." Having someone acknowledge what had happened, having a witness to the exclusion, made it feel more real and somehow more painful. I had hoped that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe the situation wasn't as deliberate as it had seemed. "Do you know why they would do that?" I asked. "Have I done something to upset them?" Sarah hesitated, and I could see she was debating how much to tell me. "There have been some conversations," she said finally, "about how you've changed since you moved away. Some people feel like you've become too good for the family, too focused on your career to care about what's happening here." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be believable. I had become focused on my career, and I had been less present in my family's daily life. But I had never thought that made me too good for them, and I certainly hadn't intended to convey that impression. "I've been busy with work, but that doesn't mean I don't care about my family," I said. "I know that," Sarah said quickly. "But perception isn't always reality, you know? And I think some people have taken your absence as a kind of rejection." "So they rejected me first?" "I don't think they see it that way. I think they see it as protecting themselves from being hurt by someone who has already chosen to leave." The logic was painful but understandable. In trying to build a life and career for myself, I had inadvertently communicated that my family wasn't my priority, and they had responded by making it clear that I wasn't theirs either. "What do I do now?" I asked. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "But I don't think pretending this didn't happen is going to help anyone." We sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the party continuing inside. I could hear laughter and music, the clink of glasses and the buzz of conversation. The celebration was carrying on without me, just as my family's life had been carrying on without me for the past few years. Eventually, I knew I had to go back inside. I couldn't hide in the garden for the rest of the party, and I needed to figure out how to navigate the remainder of the evening with some dignity intact. When I returned to the main room, the party was beginning to wind down. Some of the older relatives were saying their goodbyes, and parents were collecting tired children and gathering their belongings. The photographer was packing up his equipment, having captured what he needed for my parents' anniversary album. I approached my mother, who was standing near the gift table, organizing cards and wrapping paper. "Mom," I said, "can we talk for a minute?" She looked up with a bright smile that seemed forced. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "I was hurt that I wasn't included in the family photos today," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and non-confrontational. Her smile faded and she looked uncomfortable. "Oh, honey, we can take some pictures together before you leave. I'm sure we'll get some nice shots." "That's not the same thing, and you know it," I said gently. "Those were the formal photographs, the ones that will be framed and displayed. The ones that show who was important enough to be included in commemorating this milestone. My mother sighed and looked around the room as if seeking an escape from this conversation. "You have to understand," she said finally. "It's been difficult for your father and me. You're so far away and we never see you. Rebecca is here all the time, helping us with things, being part of our lives. Michael makes an effort to stay connected even though he's in California. But it feels like you've moved on from us." The words cut deep because they contained truth I didn't want to acknowledge. I had moved on in many ways, building a life that didn't revolve around my family of origin. But I had never intended that to mean I was moving away from them entirely. "I moved away for college and work," I said. "That doesn't mean I stopped loving you or caring about the family. I'm here today because this was important to me." "But you're here as a guest," my mother said quietly. "You're not part of our daily lives anymore. You don't call regularly, you don't visit unless there's a special occasion. You don't know what's happening in our world from week to week." I wanted to protest that phone calls worked both ways, that they could have made more effort to stay connected with me too. But I realized that would sound defensive and miss the larger point she was making. "So you decided I don't deserve to be in the family photos?" "It wasn't my decision alone," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Rebecca thought it would be awkward since you're not really integrated into the family anymore." Rebecca. Of course, my sister who had stayed close to home, who had made herself indispensable to our parents, who had clearly positioned herself as the primary daughter while I was building my career in the city. "I see," I said, though I didn't really see it all. The logic seemed cruel and circular to me. I was excluded from family moments because I lived far away, which made me feel less connected to the family, which justified further exclusion. "I'm sorry you were hurt," my mother said, but her apology felt hollow. "That wasn't our intention." But of course it had been their intention. You don't accidentally exclude one of 3 children from formal family photographs. The exclusion had been deliberate, planned, discussed in advance. I looked around the room at my family members, seeing them now with completely different eyes. These people who had raised me, who had shared my childhood, who knew me better than anyone else in the world, had collectively decided that I didn't belong in the permanent record of this important day. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. I found Rebecca arranging leftover flowers in vases, preparing to distribute them to relatives as they left. "I need to talk to you about what happened during the photo session," I said. She looked up with an expression that was part defensiveness, part resignation, as if she had been expecting this conversation. "I was organizing the photos," she said. "I had to make decisions about groupings and timing." "You made a decision to exclude me from the immediate family photos." "I made a decision to include the people who are actually part of Mom and Dad's daily lives," she said, her voice taking on an edge. "The people who show up for more than just major occasions. I'm their daughter, Rebecca. I'm your sister. You're someone who lives 3 hours away and calls maybe once a month," she shot back. "You're someone who has missed the last 3 Christmases because of work or travel plans. You're someone who couldn't be bothered to come home when Dad had his heart scare last year because you had some important assignment." The mention of my father's heart episode hit me like a slap. He had been hospitalized for chest pains that turned out to be a minor issue, but I had been in the middle of an investigation that I couldn't leave. I had called several times a day and had planned to visit as soon as the story was filed, but by then he was home and recovering and had told me not to worry about making the trip. "I was working," I said weakly. "You're always working," Rebecca replied. "And that's fine. That's your choice. But choices have consequences. You can't disappear from our lives for years and then show up expecting to be treated like the daughter who never left." Her words stung because they forced me to confront truths about myself that I had been avoiding. I had prioritized my career over family relationships. I had used work as an excuse to avoid the complicated emotions and obligations that came with staying close to home. I had created distance and then felt hurt when that distance was acknowledged. But did that justify erasing me from the family photos? Did that warrant treating me like an outsider at my own parents' anniversary celebration? I understand that I haven't been as present as I could have been, I said carefully. But excluding me from today's photos wasn't about teaching me a lesson. It was about punishing me. Rebecca's expression softened slightly, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the sister I had grown up with. Maybe it was, she said quietly. Maybe I was angry at you for leaving us behind. Maybe I wanted you to understand what it feels like to be excluded. The honesty in her admission was both painful and revelatory. This wasn't just about my absence from family events. This was about years of accumulated resentment from the sister who had stayed behind and shouldered the responsibilities I had avoided. I never meant to leave you behind, I said. I was trying to build a life for myself. I know, she said. But intention doesn't change impact. While you were building your life, I was dealing with Mom's anxiety about Dad's health, with their financial worries when the economy tanked, with all the day-to-day crises and complications that come with aging parents. I was the one who got the phone calls and made the doctor's appointments and handled the emergencies. I felt a flush of shame as I realized how much I hadn't known about my parents' recent struggles, how much I had missed by maintaining such distance from their daily lives. I should have been more involved, I said. I should have been here to help. But you weren't, Rebecca said simply. And now you show up for the celebration and expect to be included like nothing happened, like you've been here all along. We stood there facing each other, two sisters who had grown up in the same house but had become almost strangers, each carrying resentments and hurts that had been building for years. What happens now? I asked. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. I don't know, she said finally. I suppose that depends on what you want. If you want to be part of this family going forward, it's going to take more than showing up for anniversaries and sending Christmas cards. And if I can't do that? If my life and work don't allow for the level of involvement you think I should have? Then I guess we'll continue to be polite strangers who share DNA, she said sadly. The conversation ended there, with both of us recognizing that we had reached an impasse that couldn't be resolved in a single discussion at a party. The damage had been building for years, and it would take time and effort to repair, if it could be repaired at all. I spent the remaining hour of the celebration making polite conversation and saying goodbye to relatives, but the joy had gone out of the day for me. Every interaction felt strained and artificial, colored by the knowledge that I had been deliberately excluded from the family photos that would commemorate this milestone. When it came time for me to leave, my parents hugged me goodbye with the same polite warmth they had shown all day. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened, no apology for the exclusion, no invitation to discuss the situation further. Drive safely, my mother said, kissing my cheek. Let us know when you get home. Thank you for coming, my father added. It meant a lot to have you here. But did it really? If it had meant so much to have me there, wouldn't they have wanted me in the photographs? Wouldn't they have made sure I was included in the permanent record of their golden anniversary? I drove home through the darkness, replaying the day's events and trying to make sense of what had happened. The 3-hour drive gave me plenty of time to think about my relationship with my family, about the choices I had made and their consequences, about the difference between the family I thought I had and the family I actually had. By the time I reached my apartment, I had come to some difficult realizations. I had been living in a kind of denial about the state of my family relationships, assuming that love and blood ties would be enough to maintain connection despite physical distance and emotional absence. I had taken for granted that my place in the family was secure, that I would always be welcomed and included regardless of how much or how little I participated in their lives. The photo exclusion had been a brutal wake-up call. It had shown me in the most concrete way possible that my family had made a decision about my status within their circle. I was no longer considered part of the core group, the immediate family, the people who mattered enough to be included in formal documentation of important moments. The question now was what I wanted to do about it. I could try to repair the relationships, to become more involved in my family's daily life despite the challenges of distance and career demands. I could make more frequent visits, more regular phone calls, more effort to be present for both the celebrations and the crises. I could try to earn my way back into the family photos. Or I could accept that sometimes people grow apart, even family members, and that trying to force connections that have been damaged might not be healthy for anyone involved. I could acknowledge that my family had built a life that worked for them, and that my periodic presence might actually be more disruptive than beneficial. As painful as the day had been, it had also been clarifying. I now understood exactly where I stood with my family, and I could make decisions based on that reality rather than on assumptions and wishful thinking. 3 months later, I received a package in the mail from my mother. Inside was a beautifully bound photo album from the anniversary celebration, with a note that said, "I thought you might like to have some pictures from the party." I flipped through the album, looking at page after page of formal portraits featuring my parents, my siblings, my niece and nephew, and various combinations of extended family members. The photos were gorgeous, professionally shot and perfectly composed. They told the story of a family celebration, of a milestone marked with joy and love. I appeared in exactly 3 photos in the entire album casual shots where I could be seen in the background of larger group pictures, partially obscured by other people and clearly not the focus of the image. Looking at those photos, I felt a strange sense of peace. This was the truth of my place in my family, documented clearly and permanently. I wasn't the daughter who had been erased from their lives. I was the daughter who had chosen to live on the periphery, and this was what that looked like. I put the album on a shelf in my closet and got on with my life. I had work I loved, friends who valued me, and a future that I was building on my own terms. I had learned something important about the difference between the families we're born into and the families we create, between the love that comes automatically and the love that must be earned and maintained. 6 months after that, I was offered a promotion that would require relocating to another city, even further from my family. As I considered the opportunity, I realized that the decision was easier now than it would have been before the anniversary celebration. I no longer felt the weight of family expectations or the guilt about leaving them behind. They had already left me behind. The photos proved it. I took the job and moved across the country, to a place where I could build new relationships based on who I am now, rather than who I used to be. I send my parents cards on holidays and call on their birthdays. I'm polite but distant, friendly but not intimate. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if they had included me in those anniversary photos, if they had chosen connection over rejection, if they had seen my presence as valuable despite my absence from their daily lives. But I've learned not to dwell on hypothetical scenarios. The photos from that day tell a story, and I'm not the protagonist. That's the reality I've learned to live with, and in its own way, it has set me free.